Hi, I'm Tim Vandergrift, and today I'm making chicha. This is usually made from germinated dried corn, which in effect malts the corn kernels, which are then heated up with water to liquefy the starch, and then they are often chewed in a paste, and that releases amylase enzymes into them, which convert the starches into sugars. With the addition of water and perhaps a quick boil, it makes a beverage that will yield between 1 and 3% alcohol, and it can be drank young and weak and frothy, or a little bit older and stronger. It's nearly impossible where I live in Canada to get germinated dried corn, so I've settled on fresh corn on the cob, which is plentiful at this time of year, and it's very local, so that's a nice added bonus. This is from British Columbia, grown up near Chilliwack, and available in my local green grocer. I'm going to do it the traditional way. That is to say, I'm going to chew this up to add the amylase enzymes. So now, it has occurred to me that my audience may not be completely comfortable with this technique. And frankly, neither am I. Normally, the people who make chicha by chewing up the germinated and dried corn are the women of the village, and it's often a communal activity. They stand around or sit around and chew up the chicha and do the thing. Probably nobody wants to ingest the amylase enzyme from the saliva of a burly, bearded, weird guy. That's just unsavory. We can all agree on that. So instead, what I'm going to do is an alternative method. The first step is to process the corn so that it can be more easily converted. That is to say, I'm going to take the corn off of the cobs, and then I'm going to crush it into a smaller size, and that will release the starch from inside the kernels so that it can be attacked by the source of enzymes, which I will be providing.
The first step is to do a peel and reveal of my corn on the cob. This was fresh in a field only hours before I took custody of it. Peeling it is a little more work than I remember. I've never really done a dozen cobs of corn at a time, and it does get a lot of those white hairs everywhere. Still, a lot easier to obtain than germinated dried corn in my neighborhood. Once it's all peeled, the next step is to get it off the cobs. I sliced it off with a standard cooking knife, and notice that I am trying to be careful not to lop off a thumb into the brew here. The corn cobs themselves all went into the compost, so nothing was wasted, although I'm pretty sure that a squirrel got at them before they got a chance to compost very effectively. You'd be amazed at the yield you get off just a few cobs of corn. That came out to several pounds. I crushed it up in my food processor, and as I was doing so, I realized that it was going to take several batches. I have a fairly powerful industrial chef's food processor, and it made short work of it, but it made me realize that chewing this up would be quite the enterprise. I'm not sure I've got the jaw strength or the stick-to-itiveness to go through a bunch of chewy, semi-dried, germinated corn. The people who are making this beverage must really be thirsty. The yield was nice and smooth. I didn't over-process it. I didn't want to develop kind of a sticky paste. I wanted something I could handle and was still liquid enough to use and spread around.
All of the corn cutting and crushing has yielded us just over 5 pounds of crushed up corn kernels. Now, in order to get a diastatic enzyme in there that will convert that starch into maltose that can be fermented by our yeast source, we need to add something. Now, normally, this would be done with human saliva to convert it over. Instead, I'm going to use a proportion of the grist as malted barley. I've got some two-row Pilsner malt that is very, very light in color. I'm going to add approximately 60% of the weight of the corn as barley. Now, From one perspective, this could be significantly changing the character of the chicha because it is a malted grain, and despite being very, very low kilned, it could have some caramelized sugars which would affect the taste. On the other hand, normally the corn is also malted, which would modify the flavor. We're not going for complete authenticity here, we're going for verisimilitude. So I'm going to tackle this with malt, going to get some of that diastatic power in there, and so the next step for me is to take my malt, weigh it out, and crush it.
I've got about 2.5 pounds of Pilsner malt here, and I'm running a grain crusher set at about 35 thousandths of an inch. The system I'm using, the Grainfather, is very efficient, so it can use a pretty tight crush, and it will help get the maximum yield out of that malt product. Quick grind, and you can see it's been nicely and finely ground.
Okay, now we've got our corn prepared and we've got our grain crushed to provide the enzymes. It's time to mash them together to get fermentable sugars. I'm using a Grainfather. This device is essentially an automated mash and boil kettle all in one. It's very useful, especially for experimental batches. It's got a programmable controller so that you can replicate your results pretty closely nearly every time. I'm going to mash it for a fairly long time, at least 4 hours. I want to get some good fermentability.
I chose not to use any water treatment. I didn't harden it or add any minerals. The water where I live in White Rock is very soft, and I thought I'd stick to that. I doughed in with the malt first, mashed for a while, and then added in my corn mixture, and left it for almost 4 hours. I started off with a protein rest at 122 degrees Fahrenheit in order to eliminate some of the proteins and hopefully get a little tiny bit more clarity in the finished wort. After that, I boosted it up to my target heat of 148 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a range that will provide really good fermentability and get rid of most of the sugar. Here's the runoff out of the Grainfather. I actually used it as a mashing vessel in this case because I put in a false bottom. It's a modification I like to use. You can see the runoff of the wort is very, very clear, light in color, exactly what I would want it to be. I did throw in some hops and briefly boiled it in the Grainfather vessel. The hops were mosaic debittered, and I used about 7 grams, a quarter of an ounce, in a 20-odd liter yield. After the 1 minute boil, my gravity was just over 1020. The foam kind of makes it hard to read there. That's exactly what I would have expected with the wet corn that I threw in and the amount of malt. I threw in some spices, the initial dose for primary fermentation, pitched my mixed culture of yeast, and it fermented quite gorgeously. Nice, rocky, rough head, and a great corn smell to it. And it was dropped down after about 4 days.
The Chicha De Jora has been fermenting for 4 days. I used a mixed culture, partly a German wheat yeast to drive some clovey phenolics. I thought that would complement the spicing that I was doing, and partly some more standard lager yeast that I had kicking about. I wanted to make sure that we got a boldly mixed culture rather than relying on wild yeast as they would in a traditional fermentation. This is, of course, updated, and I want to make sure the product survives packaging and holds long enough to be served at SommCon 2017. It's dropped now. There's a visible sediment, so I'm just going to rack it into this carboy. The reason being I want it to get a little tiny bit clearer for packaging. Plus, I'm going to check it for spicing. I spiced it in the boil, but a lot of that may have volatilized off, and I think I want to make sure I get a nice balanced flavor. So I've got some more whole cloves and some cinnamon, and based on the taste test I'm going to get when I check my specific gravity, I'll put some more spice in or not. We'll see what happens. Anyway, on to racking.
Specific gravity is a shorthand term for measuring the density of a liquid compared to the density of pure water at 15 degrees centigrade, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This just shows us the progress of fermentation and the sugars getting eaten up and converted into alcohol. This is fermented almost completely dry. It's down to about 1002. A little difficult to read from this angle in this shot, but that's exactly where I want it to be. Excellent.
Okay, so I got a very thorough fermentation. We are down. And the taste test, it's actually delicious. I am kind of surprised. I expected it to be really thin, quite tart, and to lack a lot of definitive sort of grain flavors or corn flavors or things like that. I thought they would have been wiped out by the lightness and the low specific gravity in the finish. On the contrary, this is corny without having a dimethyl sulfide component or anything like a popcorn component. There isn't any diacetyl at all. It's clean, thorough fermentation. It does have a subtlety of spice. It's got a hint of cloviness just there, but there's very little, just a very tiny refined cinnamon note across the top. So what I'm going to do in the secondary fermentation here, or in the post-fermentation élevage phase that I'm going to put it through, is take some of my whole cinnamon stick, which I've lightly crushed, and some more cloves. I've got about 5 or 6 cloves in there, and perhaps 10 grams of cinnamon. I'm just going to pop them in there, and I'm going to leave it for around a week or so, and then I'm going to get to bottling. The Chicha De Jora has sat in the primary for about 4 days. I racked it to the secondary, where I took a little inventory of the flavor and aroma, and I dosed it with a bit more cloves, a tiny bit more cinnamon, and left it at that. So it's sat, it's settled out, it's ready for bottling. Here on bottling day, what I'm going to do is bottle it in 650 ml bombers. I've got some priming sugar here. I'll put some boiling water into this. Now, just prior to bottling, I'm going to add this. This is an infusion of cacao nibs in tequila. Is this authentic for Chicha De Jora? Ish. The tequila really isn't going to provide a lot of flavor. There's only about 150 mil here on top of cacao nibs, but it is going to give it a cacao note, I hope, in the finished product, which is not inappropriate to the style. And remember, we're not looking for complete authenticity here. We're looking for verisimilitude and an homage to the style of the beer. It's all in the bottle now. The last thing to do is to let it decarbonate. That'll probably take somewhere between 5 and 10 days. There's kind of a lot of active yeast in suspension, despite the fact that the specific gravity was down to just about 1002. It was still a little bit fizzy, so I'm hopeful that it will carbonate fairly quickly. I'm going to keep it in an area that's about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I've got a nice place that stays steady that all year. So I've got 2 dozen of my 650 ml bomber bottles, and I've got a few of these spares for testing, and we'll see what it's going to turn out like. I can't wait. And here's our final tasting day. This beer was served at SommCon 2017 down in San Diego, where I assisted Wes Hagen of J. Wilkes Wines with his presentation on ancient beverages from Pangaea to Pasteur. Fascinating presentation about the history of beverage alcohol and human civilization. His presentation was actually brilliant. I got a lot out of it myself. Right at the end, I served this to illustrate what a corn-based beverage from South and Central America would taste like to modern palates. We had a little discussion around that and how it was made, and it was fairly well received. The phenolic flavor from the cloves had been worrying me because I thought it was a little too pronounced, and it could have come off like a flaw, like perhaps a chlorophenol, that band-aidy character that you can get in certain beers. However, the cloves have faded to the background, and I'm anticipating tasting it today and getting a more balanced character of the spices. It has a little tiny white head. It's not very high or rocky. There's not a lot of stuff in there to hold the head up, but it is persistent and a beautiful pure white color. It's slightly hazy It was unfiltered, and I didn't do anything like cold crash it or anything unusual like that. But it does have a pleasing color. It's a lovely golden, no signs of oxidation, and quite nice. So let's have a little smell. It is straight up corn. And not the flawed corn a BJCP judge would pick of dimethyl sulfide, which is like cooked corn or cooked cabbage. You know, it's straight corn off the cob kernels, and it's really quite appealing. Now, under that initial corn aroma, you're getting the notes of spices. The clove, as I had hoped and predicted, the clove has died right back, and it's very subtle, and it's mixed in there with the nutmeg and the cinnamon that I added, along with the cacao nibs. So it's got a extremely subtle, spicy background, which is good. If the spices stood out any further, they could come off as flaws. They would make it all jangly. And it's not. It's a well-knitted, unified sort of an aromatic background to it. Again, corn all the way. Lovely, very fresh-tasting sweet corn. The mid-palate gets that little spike of cloves, but now it's a pleasant spicy cloviness and just right, just enough. And the nutmeg and cinnamon are kind of in the background. I think you could push the nutmeg and cinnamon a little harder and still have a pleasing result. And the cacao nibs give it just a little bit of chocolatey vanilla character in the finished structure. Overall, if you served me this beer at a picnic on a hot day, I would love it. I would think it was fantastic. Now, as an example of an ancient beverage and a historical one, I think this is pretty much a success. I really enjoyed making it. I had a lot of fun. I had a few nail-biting moments worrying about the clove character and other people, especially a bunch of really well-trained sommeliers tasting it for me, but it seems to have come out all right. So, chalk it up as a success, both experimentally and in terms of the organoleptic qualities and how much I enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. And remember, with your beer you can do anything you want, so uncap something special. Cheers.